So Courtney, you have said in the past that the way that we lead at all times is really an outgrowth of our spiritual life and our spiritual practice. And there's no time that that's more true than in times of trauma and disaster. Can you talk a bit more about what you see as the invitation of this time for us as leaders?
Yes, and thank you, Hilary, and thank you all for, really, I guess, sort of trusting all of this to invite me to share, what I've experienced and the insights I've had over the years. And I'm really sorry that I can't see everyone who's online, but I know that you're there. And I know that a lot of friends, old and new, are there. And I just want you to know that I'm thinking of you all, and I'm really glad to be with you. So a lot of the work that I have done since the 5 years that I spent directing the Office of Disaster Response in Louisiana after Katrina has really been about extrapolating lessons from the experience of how ministry changes in the context of catastrophe, and the experience of that both at St. Paul's Chapel after 9/11 and the experience in Louisiana on the Gulf Coast after Katrina. And, one way of thinking about it is that you're suddenly, the world is suddenly very, very different overnight in ways that you never could have planned for or imagined. And so, in leadership language, we're really called to suddenly become leaders of adaptive change. And, I have felt that there were a lot of reasons why we could learn a lot from the way that ministry happens in the aftermath of disaster, about really generative ways to lead change in normative circumstances. So I feel like here we are in this time where in normative circumstances, the church really needs to be learning how to be adaptive leaders. And now on top of that, we are plunged into this pandemic context, so that intensive kind of laboratory for learning how to lead adaptive change and to grow in the process of doing that spiritually, and in terms of our ministries, is kind of compounded. And so for me, because I've spent a lot of time, it really feels like a good deal of my adult career doing is kind of all coming to a head.
Mm-hmm. So what do you see for us as people who are leaders, as clergy and people on leadership bodies in the diocese, as being the particular invitation of this time for our own spiritual lives and to lead from our deep spiritual grounding?
Well, I think, it may sound counterintuitive, and in the very early stages of a crisis, kind of where we are on the timeline, because the timeline of catastrophe can be very long, multiple years, from the time that you sort of enter the dynamics to the time that events have unfolded and people have healed and you sort of move past that. But in this stage, it may sound, and particularly because we hear a lot more from experts about post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's another field of resilience work called post-traumatic growth, and there's a lot of spiritual growth that happens within all of us, really, particularly when we're engaging in other directed kinds of activities and ministries, and we're doing it in community. It is shown over and over again that people moving through catastrophe with that kind of engagement and focus tend to actually grow spiritually, and will say that they came out of the experience on the other end stronger, more resilient, more trusting of other people, more creative, with a deeper faith in God. And so I like to try and frame disaster ministry in these early days as we're going in with that hope that we will come out of the other end of this more, that's one piece of it. And then I really believe that everything else really flows from that experience of spiritual growth, and that there are things that happen to us in terms of our capacity to be attentive to others, our levels of creativity and innovation, our willingness to collaborate and to do things in a more like a self-organizing system kind of approach to things, that are extremely generative of the increase of ministry, actually. But it all flows from that spiritual transformation that's triggered when we have to face our mortality and the way that we have, and the kind of illusions that are stripped away when we do that.
Mm-hmm. So Courtney, I want to address, people have been talking in the chat about your feed is freezing. And it's hard to sometimes hear all of what you're saying. So while you work on that, I'll explain to other people. Courtney is dialing in from her apartment where she's sequestered on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So she is at the mercy of her network. Everybody around her is trying to connect online because they can't go anywhere. So hopefully, if it gets to be too bad, please let us know. And I'm happy. I'm catching what she's saying. I'm happy to restate it for others. And we can also shorten our conversation if it continues to be a problem for people. So please do let us know in the chat box how it is for you. We've checked on the tech side, and there's really nothing we can do. She's before this, she upped to as much as she can. So Courtney, can you talk a bit, thinking of this spirituality and this call to creativity in this time and collaboration, what do you see as the particular ways that being church can change for people in these times, and what have you experienced in your own time of dealing with catastrophe and disaster?
Well, I think that we as a church, and I'm hoping this is going to be better for folks in terms of my the flow of my connection, that storytelling is an extremely powerful practice in ministry. But I would say that there is never a time where it is more powerful or more needed than it is in this context. narrative and how we frame our experience and what we're going through is extremely important. And people are having such powerful, transformative experiences of God and neighbor that they really need outlets for processing it. And the kinds of relationships that form are really deep and enduring. I think both in terms of telling our own story about just, what has happened to you in the last day as a result of all of this that is really profoundly impacting you. Practically anybody you turn to and ask that question is going to have a profound story to share. Also, the bigger narrative, the kind of the public narrative that's being shaped about a disaster. When you think about 9/11 and you remember how the media really focused on the firefighters and their heroism and how they were so altruistic and going in to give up their lives to save another life, and how that sparked that impulse in millions of people who then began showing up trying to do their part and in a very altruistic way, an emulation of them. Then when you think about Katrina and the images and the way that that was framed and all the images that we saw of the people in our society who had been betrayed and left behind, and how it sparked this era of extreme passion, really, to try and engage in racial healing in this country. And 3 years later, we elected our first African-American president. So there's a lot of power, both in our individual stories and telling them, and in the big public narratives, which we can help shape really through our preaching as well. And I think, so that's just one piece that I would start with, and I can pause or I can go on to another point.
Well, I want to drill down into that point you're making about our preaching and the ways of storytelling, because something I've heard you point to in the past is about how those narratives you're referring to from 9/11 called for action and called for people to come, whereas the images that were put out of Katrina really were of just tremendous victimization, and how, thinking about how that creates a different narrative about our own agency to respond as individuals and communities, and that the stories that we tell, and likely the media is going to be coming out with tremendous images of victimhood, over the coming weeks. And you have talked, I wanted to ask you to talk a bit about points you have made about focusing our attention and the attention of our churches on the healthcare workers and on those who are really living as Christ would live, in our preaching and in our teaching. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, I remember, and this is a story that's told a lot. It seems more and more as the years go by, of that moment when Mr. Rogers was asked in an interview after 9/11, what do we tell our children? And he said, tell them to keep their eyes on the helpers. And St. Paul's was covered ceiling to floor with letters from drawings from children. And so you really did have that sense that they were keeping their eyes on the helpers. And then years later in New Orleans, we saw that generation showing up by the tens of thousands to gut and rebuild the houses in that city. So you could tell that actually focusing on the helpers in one catastrophe bore this incredible fruit in the next catastrophe, because people really were formed and shaped by that. So I think, yes, when we look at where is the parallel in this circumstance, I mean, it is the remarkable health workers. And we've got a challenge, I think, that so many of us are sequestered, and that part of what, one of the best things we can do in this case is not to mobilize, not to gather, and how hard that is, and how counter to how we're wired as human beings that really is. But how people are channeling this into social media, and we really didn't have the kinds of social media tools like Zoom or, like Instagram and Facebook and all the social media channels for us, each individual person, to actually be shaping this global narrative about what is this really about. So I think, that's one of the ways that this is going to be very different, but we still have a lot of power to exercise in terms of shaping the narrative and what we are lifting up and pointing to and saying is really instructive. What is it that Corona is trying to say to us and trying to teach us in this moment?
Mm-hmm. And I think the point that you make around this is so critical, thinking of Marshall Gantz's work with public narrative and showing, which we know as people of faith and people of scripture, that stories are what form us and they form our call to action. So the question and the power of our preaching in these moments to lift up and focus attention on the stories that can give people life and can give people agency and meaning in the midst of this is so critical. You have talked before too, as somebody who has been through disaster and crisis, about kind of natural ways that our awareness and our ways of coming together really changed during that time. Can you talk a bit more? I think we're all experiencing massive changes in our lives and in the way we're thinking and operating in the last 2 weeks. Can you talk more about what this is like?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I would say in my own experience, I'm very aware of how, at the time that I just, happened to be at ground zero because I was working at Trinity on 9/11 and was sort of plunged into that, very traumatic day. And then went back to try and help at the chapel. How I realized how at the start of it all, how really afraid of suffering I was. And how, how the context actually, cracked me open. And I mean, obviously cracked, millions and millions of people open in a way that enabled us to kind of move through that fear of, being present to pain and suffering, and gave us the experience of what it is to draw near to somebody who is in pain and who is suffering and simply be kind. I think that, that there's that one of the things that it showed is that we all have the capacity to do this. It is something that happens in us naturally if we are available, and if we are open and available to go with what happens within us when we do that. Sure helps a lot to do it in a community of support. When that happens, and I think probably also partially, I'm not a scientist and don't really know the science of the physiology of this, but I think it's probably fair to say that we all have a lot more adrenaline pumping through us right now than maybe we had a couple of weeks ago. And, kind of the combination of these things, I have seen gives us a kind of hyper attentiveness to human need. That we're actually, like, we've got our sort of antenna are up, and they're very sensitive. And so we have an ability to really be aware of where the need in our communities is most acute. And that is incredibly important because it's showing us where we need to focus our ministries and what kinds of ministries we need to form. And there's a huge part of this in this early stage, both in terms of how we're shaping the narrative, but also what we're paying attention to and how we're responding. That's really all about discernment. So I think that, that is a gift. And I think it's another way that we are like hardwired to really to show up and to be effective ministers and healers one to another. And because it is a universal human experience, there are so many people who passionately want to plug in some place where they can bring their gift and where they can express the piece of the healing that they've discerned as their role. And that, and all the people who start to show up in various ways. This time it may be in our email boxes instead of on the threshold of our churches, but the ways that people show up, offering their gift, then begins to change the whole dynamic about how we form our ministries, how we mobilize them, and how we act collectively.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting you're saying that. Yesterday I had a local reporter call because he was working on a story about what our church is going to do for Holy Week and Easter. And his question was, how would you tell people to celebrate Easter with the church being closed? And I thought, the church isn't closed. We're here, we're the community, and we're community in a very new and different way. And the call to be, and the opportunity to be creative, and seeing in my church how much people are profoundly getting what we've talked about, but not had to live into in this way, that the church is the people of God, and the tremendous creativity that can happen when our ordinary way of doing things suddenly has to change.
Yeah.
And you've talked a lot in the past about the particular qualities and nature of leadership in times of crisis. Can you talk a bit more about what those qualities are and how the way that we lead changes?
Yes. So it has been my observation that, some of us are more suited for the kinds of behaviors, kind of leadership styles that are really at home in chaos. I mean, I think we have to name it. I mean, that's, catastrophe creates a lot of chaos. And a lot of that can be generative chaos. I'm sure many of you came to St. Paul's to serve after 9/11, and you know what it felt like to be inside that church with the thousands of people who were there in and out at any given time. The podiatrist station in George Washington's box pew, the massage table in the aisles of the church where the recovery workers were receiving, healing touch and body work before they went back in to dig for body parts. and, you know, the food that was being served all the while we're celebrating the Eucharist in the middle of this. And, you know, all of this, I mean, it was incredibly powerful and incredibly beautiful, but it absolutely was not in any way, shape, or form conventional church. And it was, you know, it can feel risky to say yes to people that you don't know very well who show up saying, please let me do this, or please let me do that. But, you know, I think of the example of Katie Mears, who is now the director of domestic response for Episcopal Relief and Development. Katie showed up on our doorstep as a recent college grad of Grinnell in New Orleans, or probably at that point actually in Baton Rouge, and, you know, and said she wanted to start the housing gut and rebuild operation for the diocese. She had a very ambivalent relationship with the Episcopal Church at that time, you know, characteristic of a lot of millennials. And, you know, now she's one of our SIM scholars. You know, we've given her a substantial scholarship for her seminary education. You know, back then she wasn't sure she believed in God, but she had a passion for this ministry, and we took a chance on Katie, and boy, are we glad that we did. So, so I think there's a level of openness, of trust, of allowing people to take an idea and run with it, and to kind of self-organize their teams, and to let lots of people sort of, their ideas sort of stand or fall on their merit, based on their own self-initiation and their own motivation and skill around organizing what it is that they really want to bring to the effort. And I know, Hilary, you were telling me yesterday about a soup ministry that's grown up in your community. And to me, that is like a perfect example of what I'm talking about, how that it just springs up, and it's really driven by the passion and the faithfulness of a lot of grassroots folks, some of which may not have been attached to the church ever or for a long time, but having that trust and really having to trust the movement of the Spirit, that, you know, not, and to be okay with some of them failing. You know, some of them may become, you know, major stories on the national news before it's all over. And some of them may, you know, fizzle out after a few weeks, and that's okay. That's the nature of this kind of context and this kind of time. But the way that this can grow a congregation, how it can grow a diocese, so that, you know, on the other side of this, you're so much more connected, you're so much more experienced and alive. You know, it's really, really remarkable, the enduring kinds of blessings that can come from this if you're willing to really trust God and go with it.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned before to kind of knowing ourselves, and that in times particularly of immediate chaos, people who have more of an orientation towards just build it, here you go, see what takes off, kind of can thrive in times like this. And those of us who need more structure and like to have things done in a very orderly way, will find ourselves very challenged in these times. Can you talk more about why that is, what you see in that, and what qualities we may be, you know, or what risks we may be called to take that we wouldn't usually take, and the opportunity of that for us?
Well, I mean, you know, this is kind of getting down to the nitty gritty, because when you really get into it, you know, there is some tension that can take place, between folks who have a different view of what the wise course forward may be. And hopefully that can be like a healthy tension, where we see people with different strengths helping us achieve the right balance going forward. We'll laugh about it together. I was actually on the phone with him this morning. Mark Stevenson was canon to the ordinary for Bishop Jenkins, and I was the director of the Office of Disaster Response. So we were kind of, at the right and left hand of the bishop through all of this. And, Mark is amazing administrator. And he loves structure and discipline. And he was a phenomenal leader through this, but he really, he had to adapt a lot, because you just can't control the kind of explosion of ministry that can take place in a context like this. And you really don't want to try. But he and I, felt like we were a really great team, because, I was kind of the, big vision, we've got to go for it, let's like hurl ourselves into it kind of force. And he was the person who was kind of, imposing what structure was possible. And, as resources flowed in and money had to be managed on a huge scale and all of that kind of thing, that was where a person who has those kind of great kind of high J on the Myers-Briggs kind of administrative skills could be invaluable. But there was also this, this huge kind of room for people who are risk takers and kind of, very creative and, to sort of break out and thrive. So it's a really interesting kind of dynamic and balance there. And when you can strike the right balance, it is, it can really sing and be quite remarkable.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you in terms of the qualities that we're called to live into as leaders is really leaning into saying yes to people, even and especially when we have no idea where something's going to lead or how it's going to go. Being willing to say yes to things that we know might fail or could fail. Being willing to say yes to people we don't know. And coming into relationships in different ways.
I would also add, I often hear people say that, disaster ministry is a team sport. And I don't think there's any circumstance where it is more important to go into what you're doing with a really deep collaborative heart, because the scale of things that need to happen, they just can't be done by an individual church or an individual organization. You see a lot of interfaith collaboration happening in times like this, and it's a great opportunity to build ecumenical relationships across the diocese, but also between congregations and with agencies, say like Episcopal Relief and Development and other parts of the national church structure, because it's in times like this that people really do come together, and people, because of the sense of urgency and what's at stake, and that people are more likely by far to say yes and to cooperate than they are in normal circumstances.
Right. So we do want to transition to taking questions. And I invite anybody who has questions to type them into the chat box. Bonnie has a question. could we think about how we shape who is the victimizer in this scenario? A common enemy, question mark, is her question. Bonnie, I'm going to unmute you. Do you want to say more about that question?
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't really summarize my thoughts in the chat window very well, but I guess I was thinking about, like, with 9/11, there seemed to be sort of a, they did this to us, right, as a country. And this is bigger than us. This coronavirus thing is the whole world. But there are pockets of racist comments about people of, with Asian last names or whatever, where people are saying, it's their fault. And some of that is coming from some unfortunate people with some big megaphones. So yeah. I guess what I'm thinking of, but with Katrina, it was very regional, and there were the helpers, and there were the heroes, and then there were the people who were victimized by a larger system, or saw themselves that way anyway. So technically the enemy in this case is the virus, but it seems like this particular scenario sets us up to have to be very careful about how we decide who's at fault, because people are gonna, those kind of conversations are already coming up, who cause this cascade of problems, whether it's supply chain problems or whatever. I'm just thinking in terms of how we shape those stories as we're presenting them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm thinking back to, the fact that we had Rowan Williams with us on the morning of 9/11 at Trinity. Wow. He was supposed to we were filming him leading these 4 meditations on the shaping of holy lives. And we were supposed to start filming at 8:45, and the first plane flew in at 8:46. But the next day, he was there. He was in New York to give the Hobart lecture at St. John the Divine the next day. And he kept that schedule. And folks came together at St. John's, and we had a Eucharist together, and he preached on Ephesians. That through Christ, those who were far off have been brought near. That was the text that he preached on. And he said that we had been spoken to in one language the previous morning by the terrorists. And the question was, would we reply to them in the same language? Or would we find another language in which to speak? And, that really shaped from the very beginning the theological framing of everything we tried to be after that. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of hate in New York. As you moved around the city, you could feel it. And I could tell a million stories to illustrate it. But what you also noticed was sometimes that someone would speak in a different language, like all the homeless people of the neighborhood showing up at the chapel in a gang to give us all their cups of coins. So, we really shaped our narrative around how collective acts of love had the power to literally drive the darkness out. And that was our consistent message and focus throughout. And it was part of why the chapel became a kind of magnet for people around the world who also embraced that narrative. So like we had orphans come from Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the original ground zeros to St. Paul's to express their condolences and say how sorry they were for our losses and how they, as victims, were now had now dedicated their lives to become healers. You know, we had Michael Lapsley come from South Africa, who was the first, white member of the ANC, Episcopal priest, and he got a letter bomb, and he celebrated the Eucharist, with prosthetic hooks for hands, at St. Paul's, came from South Africa to do that. So that's part of why I talk about how important the narrative framing is, and that we have the power to frame the narrative in a way that really becomes an incredible healing and evangelizing witness. Sometimes we have a bigger megaphone in these situations for people to hear us and see us behaving in that way than we do in normative times too.
And that gets to a point that Holly had typed in, of that we want church to be community in the stories that people tell about this time. And that question of who will we be in the stories, and who does church become in people's awareness?
I don't know if anybody saw Governor Cuomo's press briefing yesterday, but it was so moving to me, this part of it, that I actually took the time to transcribe it, and I emailed it out to a bunch of friends of mine I've worked with in recovery and stuff, and New Yorkers and former New Yorkers. And he talked about that the reason that New York is particularly vulnerable, our weakness, is because we are so close, and that we live so close, and that we're so open to all the people of the world. And that it is true that sometimes your greatest weakness is also your greatest strength. And he went on basically to give an incredible sermon about the power of being vulnerable to one another, being emotionally close, even if we're not physically close anymore in this context. And it's up on YouTube, and I just highly commend it, because I think in terms of, I'm kind of scanning for what is the narrative in this situation. And I think there were some pieces of it in what he had to say yesterday, that we're learning a lot about our proximity and our nearness to neighbor. Mm-hmm. I think we're learning something about the sacrament of embodiedness too. Mm-hmm. Having to make all of our interactions and connections and so forth through this kind of media. I think there's some stuff to think about on that front as well.
Yeah. Why I was so eager for people in our diocese to hear from you is because I feel so blessed to have you in my life. And the shared sense we have of the creativity and the opportunity that can come in moments like this, and I think I used to work as a trauma chaplain. So I think, responding to trauma is always that moment of, oh my God, what's happening? And then the response after that, which can really allow us to open ourselves in tremendously different ways that are deep and profound. And you had mentioned the soup ministry. And to me, it is such a powerful illustration of everything you're saying, because we have a feeding program, Caring for Friends, that once a month gathers and makes meals in the parish hall. And it's usually a collection of, gathering of some people who aren't members of the church and some people who are. And we've always really celebrated that a lot of people who aren't part of the church are part of that. And I was walking out of the chapel last Sunday, and I think as many of us have experienced on here, I was incredibly sad after having just led online worship, and feeling very lonely and very frightened leaving and not knowing who will be in those pews the next time that we gather. And I was actually, I was crying as I walked out the door, and standing right outside were two people, Patty and Craig Slavchev, who were members of the church years ago and have not been for years, and were dropping off hundreds of soups to our parish house because the feeding program decided to collect soups. And I said, oh my God. And they said, well, we just dropped off 250 soups. And I said, wow, that's amazing. This is like restored my faith in humanity. And they said, well, this is only part of it. We have our whole neighborhood making soup. And we're trying to get up to 500. And the next day when we had our collection, we had over 720 soups that were brought to the church, and people all over Yardley had been cooking soup for this ministry. And the church was so inspired by what they did that Lori Kenrick, who leads that, said, well, from now on, we're going to do soup collection every Monday from 8 to 9. And people said, well, my teenagers are home. If people don't want to come out, they can drop off soup containers and they can go out and pick soup up from people's doorsteps and all, and we're talking about doing cooking, Facebook Live, cook along with us to make large batch soups. And this kind of thing that usually takes so much organization to do every month just grows and grows. And there are so many other amazing stories like that really, the creativity of this time, and something you have said to me in the past of really going where the energy is and allowing things to fade if there's not energy to sustain them, and allowing things to grow even if they weren't what we thought was on the critical path that does gather energy and passion.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a perfect example. I mean, I love that story. I love that story, Hilary. And really kind of the genesis of the idea of doing this today just kind of came out of the fact that Hilary and I were calling each other up in the evening and just having these great conversations, like brainstorming about everything. So it's really not a formal kind of presentation at all. It's more like the impulse of having these great conversations and wanting to be able to share that experience more broadly. But I kind of commend, calling each other up and comparing notes and, exchanging those stories about like what happened in your church today that blew you away, or really inspired you or really challenged you. But, these are going to be very full, very full days with a lot to process on a daily basis. And thank God that we can at least call each other up or get together on Zoom and email each other about all of this, since we can't actually do like we did at St. Paul's and sit in the pews and the candlelight through the night, exchanging with one another the stories of what was on our hearts, and I also feel the loss of the ability for us to do that. But the best thing we can do right now is not to do that.
Yeah. Well, and despite that, the tremendous opportunity for collaboration that we have when our buildings are physically closed and we're able to gather across boundaries. We just had a harp concert this afternoon because our usual in-person performer canceled. And so my best friend from college, who's a harpist, gave this incredible concert from Dallas, from her own home that we never would have had if it had been ordinary times. And so what can we do together as clergy and as churches, and how can our people learn to come together in new ways to make us different at the end of this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Bob Anderson typed something that I thought would be lovely for us to end with, but I wanted to see if the bishop had any comments before we did that. No? Okay. So Bob said, reminded us that today the church remembers Richard Allen, who said about the African American response to the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793, "The Lord was pleased to strengthen us and remove all fear from us, and our hearts to be as useful as possible." May that be said of our church in these times. Amen.
Amen. Beautifully put.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Courtney, and thank you all who joined us to be part of this conversation. And we look forward to continuing conversations in some form about how we can be creative together, how we can collaborate together, and how we can serve and step into the opportunity of this time and deepen our spirituality in the trauma and disaster of this time as well. So thank you all very much for coming.
God bless you all, and sending lots and lots of prayer and love.
Goodbye all.